let's get our guest on, Professor Len Sherman. Len, how you doing today?
Alrighty. How are you guys?
Hello,
Fantastic.
Len. Welcome to Show Me the Money. I think this is your second or third. I don't know. I think it's your third.
I think second. You get to my age and it's tough to remember.
Yeah, it's all good. So, as you may know or not know, Len Sherman, professor at Columbia Business School, he has done multiple articles regarding Uber and their path to cash cow that they are these days. Some went viral, some went under the radar. But he's back. He's back with another article, being a pain in the ass to Uber. And so, disclaimer, there is an official Uber comment that I'm going to read at the end of our interview, and I'm going to give Len a chance to respond to their comment. And so, Len, tell us about short, and then we'll dig deeper, obviously, in a minute or two. What is this about? First of all, how did you come about doing this? How did it all start? What did you do? Right? And then why did you do it? And then lastly, how could this potentially help the driver community? So,
Sure.
Floor is yours.
Well, let me start. Just thanks for having me. I actually, for real, I really enjoy being on your show, listening to your show. I learn a lot. I couldn't do what I do unless I kind of learned a lot from you guys. The last time you asked how many times I've been on the show, I just remember the one other time about 18 months ago, I had just then published an article suggesting that Uber's US average take rate across the board and ride sharing was 40%. And Uber was not happy with that at all. So this isn't the first time I think we're going to cross swords, because as I'll share with your listeners today, at some point, based on my latest work, at least for some drivers Uber should want to treat fairly, the majority of trips that they're getting accepted by some of your power drivers that listen to your show, and maybe he's on, their average take rate is more like 50% now, when it's generating 80% of the profits they earn on the behalf of their drivers. So we'll obviously be crossing swords, and I'll be anxious to hear what Uber's reaction so far is, but I'd be happy to answer, give you my response to it. How did I get involved with this? I worked for a long time, over 30 years in management consulting, mostly to the worldwide automotive industry. So I've hung around cars all my life. I've been around the world talking to people in and around the car business. So it was kind of natural that I would be interested in Uber and its relationship to that industry. And now that I'm teaching at Columbia Business School, teach business strategy to a bunch of MBA students who pay a lot of money to go to school. I use a lot of cases, and every year their favorite case is Uber. And the reason is it's a hell of a story. I mean, it's a company that lost more money than any company, any startup ever. $32 billion, give or take a few million. And they've now turned into this money machine. Chris, you can throw up figure one, I think it is, just to give a quick picture of what I'm talking about. I mean, this doesn't happen very often. A company, that starts by losing as much money as they did, and then turns into this, as I call it, cash generating machine. Just one little detail, and then we'll move on from that. But you can see that pretty soon after Dara Khosrowshahi got hired as CEO, he started doing a bunch of really smart things and really started driving the company from 2019, when they went public, on up through 2021, close to break even. But then they kind of stalled out. And, the effect of all the good things he was doing had their effect. And something changed somewhere in 2022, and that rocket ship took off again. So why did I do this research? Why I've been focused on the company for the last 3 years, trying to understand what the hell happened. And we'll talk about that today, sometime in 2022, to make this rocket ship take off. So you can get rid of this.
Okay, so just, I know we're going to go into much deeper than this. Can you I don't think it's a coincidence, by the way, that where you had the red turn into small green and then
Boom.
ridiculous, just through the roof kind of a green, happens to coincide with upfront fares, going from rate cards to upfront fares, pretty much nationwide, with the exception of a few states. So just wanted to remind the community that when you do look at these graphs or screenshots, I know we're going to go a little faster than normal because there's a lot to discuss, but I highly, highly, highly recommend that you guys go check out. It's on Twitter. I tweeted it out yesterday, but you guys can go to Medium, and under Len Sherman, this article in its full entirety, full length, is there with all the screenshots, so you can take your time and take a look at all the data that Len uncovered. So continue, Len.
Sure. All right. So what did we find? You know why I was trying to dig into this. What did we find? Just at a very high level and very quickly, definitive proof that the biggest driver of their immense profit turnaround in the last 3 years has been the implementation of upfront fares, upfront pricing, which I believe is the largest scale ever implementation of algorithmic price discrimination on both sides of their marketplace. In English, what does that mean? Price discrimination, it has nothing to do with gender, race, color. It's all about a company that figures out, using very smart algorithms, analytics, huge databases, what is the maximum price that customers are willing to pay for a product, and what's the minimum pay that a supplier of that product is willing to accept to provide that product. And if you could match those two together on every one of the 3 billion trips, give or take, that you deliver in the US on ride sharing every year, you're increasing that spread. Prices are going up and pay is going down. And I'll show you the definitive proof, as Sergio just referenced, what that actually looks like from the driver's perspective on hard data, lots of hard data on one particular driver that I'll mention. So we've definitively answered the question of what's really driven that cash generating profit machine, and it's the implementation of upfront pricing. But we've been able to kind of dig deeper and go, I think, further than most other studies that I'm aware of, into trying to understand how does this algorithm work and what specific tactics does it allow Uber to apply to everyday drivers. For example, we found that on these forward dispatch trips, these are the trips where you get the ping where you still have a butt in the back seat and you know what your next ride is if you accept it, that Uber has been able to raise prices to riders for those trips, not share that price premium with drivers. What a surprise there. Therefore, increase their Uber's take rate on those trips, but delivering much worse service to riders. Why do I say that? Because you'll see data that shows that the wait time for that poor schmuck on the other side of that forward dispatch trip that didn't know it was a forward dispatch trip is now waiting 40 to 60% longer for that ride to arrive than the trips that just come through, the normal guys between rides accepting a ride.
Yep.
So, and also rider cancellation rates are a lot higher on those trips because they're getting tired of waiting. So you're charging riders more for worse service, and drivers are getting more cancellations, lower tips probably because you got pissed off riders, et cetera, et cetera. Another finding, pretty clear evidence that Uber is shaving the value of surge bonuses for drivers. Hey, they'll tell you, hey, there's a $3 surge in this trip. But what's going on behind the scenes is that they're lowering the base fare to which they added the surge, so that net, you're not really getting the full value of the surges they're telling you you're getting. A lot of your listeners, I know, have experienced this. I've seen screenshots on your show. Hey, look at this. This is crazy. Look how low my base fare was. But this is not a screenshot or two. This is thousands and thousands of trip records where we've been able to document exactly what Uber is paying, how big is the surge, and what does it mean for drivers. So anyway, I'll go through a bunch of those findings.
Can we take one step back real quick here? Yeah. So I want to ask you, obviously you didn't do this by yourself, right? And whose data or what data was used? Okay. and who did the analysis of this? Because look, again, and the Medium article is out there. Please go check it out. Please check it out. There's a lot more in there than we're going to be able to discuss due to time constraints today. But this wasn't done by like a couple of high school students. Okay, so let's go into that. Whose data was used?
Yeah.
I think it was Uber's data, right? But you can tell us. And then who did the analysis of this?
All right. So, how do we know these things? I'm, making these summary of findings going a mile a minute here. How do we know these things? So Uber makes a promise to all of its drivers. It's right on their corporate website, and riders, that says, hey, anyone who has used our platform, rider or driver, who would like it, just go through these simple steps. The steps are laid out on their website, and we will share with you your trip history. So with that as background, I started putting out the word to a bunch of drivers I know or know of, and they passed the word to others. And I started getting emails from drivers saying, hey, I'd be happy to help you out. I'll go ahead and request it and share it with you. And I said, great. And I collected a bunch of these trip histories, which I'll describe a little bit more in a second. But it's very important that I said there's one particular kind of driver. I'm not going to go over hundreds and hundreds of drivers. I want to look for one particular driver, because we're going to really dive really deep into what years and years of 31,000 trips can tell us. And the requirements I had is I want a driver who drove for at least 5 years. I want to get 2019, the year before COVID, and compare it to today and what's happened then versus now. I wanted the driver to always drive in the same city, because there are different conditions in different cities. I wanted the driver to only drive for Uber, and predominantly for UberX. We're only going to look at UberX. I don't want to get into reserve rides and Uber Premier and all that stuff. And I want someone with a high acceptance rate, and I want someone with an extremely low cancellation rate, and I want someone with a 4.9 or higher rating. The guy I chose met all those criteria. Okay. 4.99 rating. He got one non-5 on his last 500 trips. Good guy. This is the kind of driver. So you could say, well, why do you get to base all this stuff just on one driver? This is the kind of driver Uber should value. Everything I just said is exactly what Uber should be looking for in all their drivers. And they're going to bust their chops for 5 years on your platform, delivering great service to riders, accepting most of the trips you offer. Why wouldn't you value and want to take care of this guy? So let's see how this guy is done. And that's the deep dive we took. So I had two MBA students and myself poring over these data records. And I'll tell you that any driver listening today who wants to request their data, you get a lot of information in the dump that Uber gives you. You won't, trust me, you won't know what to do with it. It's really complicated. And I had two scary smart MBA students who are a lot better at math than I am, working for 8 months, poring over this data back and forth. We met weekly, many times a week. So anyway, a lot of work went into this with a lot of data. That's.
Would it be fair to say that you guys kind of reverse engineered the pricing algorithm?
That was the plan. We went as far as we could. I think we've gone farther than anyone else, but there are still some deep dark secrets we don't know because
all right,
it's Uber's prerogative. So there you go.
Okay.
And then, the last thing you'd asked is, what does this all mean to your audience, to drivers on Uber's platform? Look, I'm not going to tell you anything that you didn't suspect, but I think hopefully by the end of this show, you'll know much more definitively that your hunches and what you've been experiencing is the real deal. It's happening because we have tons and tons of data to show that this is not just a one-off screenshot. This is what the world looks like for Uber drivers around. Yeah,
well, in our world, Len, as we say it, what happens is that we do feel it as drivers, but we can't prove it, right?
Yeah.
So this is proof. This is proof of what we've been feeling, experiencing from the rate card to upfront fares. And so, it's black and white. It's on paper. So let's get into whatever you want to talk about.
What does it mean to you? What I would say is, I hope you'll get an appreciation that you are up against a company that has immense resources, huge analytic skills, the biggest database the world's ever seen in this sector. And they're deploying all of those capabilities for their benefit, not yours. Hey, I don't begrudge them. They should do that. But just be aware that they are not your friend. They are out there to cut the best deal they can on 3 billion rides a year. And you better be as shrewd and smart and use all the tools you can to try to level the playing field as best you can. Don't just blindly accept all the stuff that comes your way. That will not work well for you. It'll work great for them. And by all means, I've talked to the CEOs of all these decision support apps like Maximo and Solo and GigU and others. Use whatever tools you can get that you feel comfortable with, because you need all the help you can get. So that's basically what I'd say.
By the way, that's 3 billion trips a quarter, not a year. So.
Well, no, but in this country, I think you're referring.
Oh, in this country, okay, never mind. Yeah, because we, towards the end, once you go through your screenshots, we should also hit upon that there was a similar study done with much less depth, I would say, by Oxford College in UK. So we'll talk about that.
I'll mention that at the end.
Okay.
One thing I always say is work smarter, not harder. If you aren't using the Solo app, then you may be working harder. So let's change that. Download the app, link your accounts where you can manage your income, track your expenses, and project your taxes. Not only that, but you can plan by optimizing your time, make more, and even guarantee your daily pay with guaranteed earnings. Download Solo and begin to work smarter, not harder today. Link is in the description. All right, let's get back to it.
Let's dig in. Let's go figure 3, Chris, and we'll take a look. Okay, so if I didn't show you that chart a minute ago that said something happened in the middle of 2022 that just took Uber's profitability off like a rocket ship, and you had to guess when that happened, let me just describe what you're looking at for those of you who are in front of a screen or a phone and can see this. And I think it'll be pretty obvious when upfront pricing came into effect. So what I've shown here, the blue in the top chart, the blue line is the average price per mile that riders paid for the 24,000 trips that we used in this analysis, by month and year between 2019 and 2025. So as you can see, the blue line is the price per mile went up, 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 up from the beginning to the end. But it's a different picture with what driver pay was. And this is this driver, 24,000 trips. What was his average pay per mile? And right around, I'll tell you when it was September 1st, 2022. And that was the day in his city, in that particular driver's city, that upfront fares kicked in. And guess what happened to driver pay? Down, down, down it went. And you can see the reverse spike on the bottom chart is Uber's take rate started climbing steadily starting on September 1st, 2022. So it's not rocket science. If you can raise prices and lower cost, i.e. pay, you're going to make a higher profit margin. And that certainly has been the case. All right. So by the way, just to give you a snapshot, roughly around that time when upfront fares kicked in, Uber's average take rate, at least for this driver, was about 32%. And by the end of this period, which, we took it out through February of this year, it was 10 percentage points higher, from 32% to 42%.
Yeah. I
work with a lot of companies that would damn near kill to get a 1 or 2% increase in their gross profit margin.
Yep.
And to achieve a 10 percentage point improvement is just like, it's a good thing.
Well, multiply that times 4 million drivers in the US.
Yeah, well, so now go to the next slide. What is this worth to Uber? It's allowed them to achieve what I call the trifecta of profit improvement. The trifecta. What does that mean? They're making much higher take rates on each trip, on higher price trips. The only thing better than having a higher margin is applying that higher margin to a higher price trip. And then on top of that, the other thing that we don't talk about as much about upfront pricing, but Uber talked about it when they very, very first introduced upfront pricing. They said, hey, we're going to rebalance. Remember that? We're going to rebalance prices. And what that means is we're going to raise prices on shorter trips and lower prices on longer trips. Why would they want to do that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, they would want to do that because the amount of money that Uber makes per trip on a long trip is way more than the amount of money they make on a short trip. Even with the lowering of prices for longer trips, the lowering of take rates on longer trips, they're making 2 to 3 times as much on a 10-mile trip than on a 3-mile trip. So the trifecta: higher take rates across the board, on average, higher price trips, more long trips. And we simply looked at what was the profit per trip that this driver, who's given 24,000 trips in our analysis, what was the average price per trip Uber made on him for his 2019 trips versus what they made on each of his trips in 2024.
Mm-hmm.
And the difference is in this last box on the upper right. It was about $1.30 per trip higher gross profit. Now, Chris, I've heard you say multiple times in the show over the years, with the kind of volume that Uber does, even if they could shave a nickel or a dime a trip, it adds up to real money. We're not talking nickels and dimes. We're talking about dollars, plural. So just total back of the envelope. I'm not pretending this is like the SEC audited perfect number. But if you just take kind of this guy's experience and say, if Uber's making on average $1.30 more per trip, and they give it around 3 billion US trips, that's worth about $4 billion. The same upfront pricing policy went into effect in London and in Frankfurt, Germany, and in Rio de Janeiro. And so, you take this across the world and this kind of profit improvement, and that's why we've come to the conclusion that the biggest driver of Uber's profit improvement over the last 3 years is this. This change was devilishly effective, but it's just as opaque as it is effective. So now the question is, how are they doing it and how does it actually work in practice? So let me catch my breath and we'll move to that section. All right. Why don't we put up the next slide? Now, I'm going to try to keep this as simple as possible, but I just wanted to give you a visual to see how important the change from the old pricing rules with rate cards were and how does it work today under upfront pricing. So what we did is we looked at, in this case, there were about 2,300 trips that this driver gave in 2019. And for each trip, we said, all right, what was the trip distance and what was the duration, the P3 time? And if there was a surge, how much was the surge? And then we just created this formula that said, okay, well, what the rider paid and what the driver was paid is a function of how long was the trip, how long did it take, and what was the amount of the surge? And we just run it through this analysis, and out comes a prediction. We can predict, if you just give me those 3 things, what the price would be, and then we can compare our prediction to what they actually paid and what they actually paid the driver. Okay. So what I've shown on the left here is our prediction, just using a simple formula: distance, time, and surge. What was the driver pay versus the actual? And you can see it's just almost a perfect fit with 98% accuracy. You tell me the time, distance, and surge. I'll tell you what the rider paid, and I'll tell you what the driver was paid. Just, it's math. And by the way, it should be no surprise. There was a rate card. There was a certain dollar per mile. There was a certain dollar per minute, and surges were strictly additive. There was a surge. We added to the price for the rider. We added to the pay for the driver. Done. So this is what we expected. This is what we got.
Okay.
Next chart. Now we go to 2024, and this time the guy has given 5,500 UberX trips in 2024, and we just ran the same exact formula. All right, how well can we predict what the rider will pay and what the driver will be paid based on those 3 factors? Not very well. There's this big scatter. This is called a scatter plot, and there's just a wide variability. So if you look across the line, you look across the chart from left to right, for any given predicted price, you can see that the actual price or the actual pay varies considerably. by 30, 40, 50% from what the average would be, which was what the predicted line would be. So this is just a visualization of how much flexibility Uber has gained through upfront pricing to charge actual prices and actual driver pay significantly different than would be implied by the old rate rules. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So what does that buy them? What does that mean? So go to the next chart. This is where it's going to get even more interesting. So in the top box, the top chart on this slide, I said back in 2019, that's the blue bars. Anything you see as blue is what happened in 2019. Back in 2019, 86% of every trip was within plus or minus 10% of the average for a trip of that distance, that duration, and whatever the surge was. And again, if you tell me what the price, pay, distance, time, and surge, 86% of the time, it's going to be very close to the predicted amount. In 2024, only 22% of all these trips, of all the 5,500 plus trips, only 22% were within that plus or minus 10% range. So it used to be very predictable pay, and that was the standard and that was the norm. And now the norm is variability. The norm is you're in a crapshoot. If you're a rider, God only knows what the price is going to be. If you're a driver, God only knows what the pay is going to be. Yep. The norm is there's going to be high variability. Okay, what does that mean? Well, the vast majority of trips are outside the kind of norm. So what are those exceptions? And I think there's three important exceptions to look at. And those are the three boxes you see in the bottom of this chart. The first is the cases where the rider paid at least 10% more than the average for trips of that distance and time and surge. The second is the driver was paid at least 10% below what the average would be for the basic trip characteristic. And the third is when you can do both. Wow, you can jack up the price and whack down the pay. All right, the first one, rider price premiums. On 22, that's the first red bar, 22% of the trips, I charged the rider at least 10% above what the average should be for trips of that time and duration and surge. But those trips are, price premium really valuable. The take rate on those trips is the second red bar is 49%. Whoa, that's a great take rate. Yep. And it represents 33% of the total profits that Uber made on this guy's 5,500 trips that year. So this is a great profit generator for Uber to be able to charge riders selectively higher prices as long as they're willing to pay. But as much as riders have donated to Uber's cause, drivers have given up more. Why do I say that? The second box, more than 1/3, 34% of every trip this guy gave paid him, these are trips he accepted, paid him 10% or more below what the average for trips of that distance, duration, and surge should be. So he's accepting a lot of trips that are paying lousy pay. And not surprisingly, the take rate on those trips is 50%. And it's generating 39, almost 40% of Uber's total profits. So you can see there's this disproportionate amount of the overall profitability coming from either charging riders more, paying drivers less, and oh my gosh, what if we can do both? What about the trips where driver paid a ton and the rider got paid peanuts? And you guys have had tons of screenshots on the screen. Look at this crap, 70% take rate. This is awful. It makes for a great show. You guys have wonderful screenshots. But let's not kid ourselves. It's a small portion of the total. So it was only 4% of trips that fell in that kind of super extreme. But those are great trips. 57% average take rate, generating 7% of profits. Bottom line, 60% of this guy's trips charge riders at least 10% more, paid drivers at least 10% less, or both. And those 60% of trips generated a take rate of 50% and generated 80% of Uber's profits on behalf of what the trips this guy delivered. Yep. This is what upfront pricing does. It spreads that margin on a large number of trips and becomes the cash generating engine that Uber has now become. I couldn't say that more clearly than the numbers speaking for themselves.
Yep.
Okay. Lastly, and then we can see what Uber thinks about all this great stuff. So let's go to, what do I have now? Oh yeah, well, let's dig into two specific examples, and every driver on this program can relate to the two last analyses I'll share with you. So let's go to the next slide, Chris. So let's dig into these forward dispatch trips that I mentioned earlier. And again, these are trips where you've still got a paying passenger in the seat, and ping, up comes the next trip request, and you've got 10 seconds, whatever, to accept it. You accept it, and off you go. Okay. I actually took two different driver trip histories for this analysis. They were in two different states. They're different driving patterns. But the first thing that struck us when we dug into just how many of their trips were forward dispatches. Wow, these things happen often. So the first driver, the red bar is the red bar is the percentage of total trips that are forward dispatch. The first guy was about 40%, and the second guy was about 60% of his trips were forward dispatch. Maybe these are unusually high, but this is what's happening. Okay. Let's just focus on the 60% case. So these are great trips for riders in one sense. If you're a rider and you request a trip and Uber can figure out, hey, we got an en route driver, let's shoot him real quick, shoot him a forward dispatch request. He accepts it, and within seconds, the rider says, hey, we got a match for you. And I think riders would find that terrific and get such a quick confirmation of a match. And if that's the reason, or for whatever reason, Uber is charging riders a higher price per mile on the forward dispatch trips than on the non-forward dispatch trips. So look at the second box on the top. The driver two, the one who did 60% of his trips forward dispatch, riders were paying $4.08 per mile for those forward dispatch trips versus $3.67 for the normal trips.
Can I just mention one thing, that the rider has no idea when they order a trip if this is a forward dispatch trip or it's just a regular trip, correct?
Yeah, as far as let's put it this way, I've never seen it on my rider.
I haven't either. So as a rider, I haven't seen it either. Yeah.
But okay. I'll tell you what, I'll show you in a second that riders can figure it out.
Okay.
Sort of.
Oh,
all right.
okay.
So the Uber's in a position, because they can give such a quick match, to extract a higher price from riders. How much do you think they share with drivers? That price premium for the surprise, for driver one, there was no difference between forward dispatch and non, and for the second driver, a small difference. So basically, if you can extract a higher price from your riders but not have to pay your drivers very much, guess what happens to Uber's take rate? And that's what the fourth box, the first one on the lower left, says, that for both drivers, the take rate Uber earns on forward dispatch trips are higher than, quote, normal trips. Mm-hmm. Okay, so what does this all mean? Drivers are paying more, but getting worse service. Why do I say that? Because the one that just blew us away, this knocked us off our chair when we saw the results, is the fifth panel in this chart. What's the average wait time for riders who, as Sergio said, have no idea that the trip is or is not a forward dispatch? But on the trips that were forward dispatch, the average rider wait time was 40 to 60% higher than the trips that were assigned on a, quote, normal basis. And not surprisingly, on the sixth and last panel on this chart is the rider cancellation rate. What percent of all trips that this driver accepted, or these two drivers accepted, that the rider canceled were forward dispatch versus not forward dispatch? So again, let's focus on driver two. 8% of his, 10% of his trips were canceled by riders overall. And 4 times as many of those cancellations were on forward dispatch trips as non-forward dispatch trips. So you're charging riders more for worse service, generating higher cancellation rates. The driver's not getting much benefit from it, and usually is winding up with a pissed off passenger. For all I know, is tipping less too. I didn't look into that. The house always wins. Uber is winning at the expense of riders and drivers in this case.
Yep.
2 cases, actually. Last one. Let's go to the last deep dive analysis. Surge trips. Surges, as we all know, have been with us and Uber from the beginning. It was one of their great early innovations to figure out that they could use surge pricing to balance times of day where there was a supply-demand imbalance. But the rules in the old days used to be pretty straightforward. If there was a surge, we know what the base price would be in the old days. It was right off the rate card. And if there was a surge, let's say it was a $3 surge, you added the $3 to the driver's base pay, and you added the same $3 to the rider's price. Very simple, predictable, knowable. All right, so we looked at back to the one driver I've used for much of this analysis. What was his experience with surges since upfront fares came into being? So what we did is we looked at 2022 up to the point in 2022 where upfront fares were implemented, and then compared it to 2024. What was the frequency and value of surges? So the first thing you notice is that the frequency with which Uber offers drivers a surge has dramatically decreased. And you all know that. You guys have experienced it yourselves. I'm sure this guy is not the one exception. Not only are the frequency that surges were offered of any size, but the value of the surge has also come way down. So it used to be in 2022 that the average surge value per time a surge was applied was over $4. And in 2024, now with upfront pricing, it's only $2.49. And I think what Uber has figured out is they don't need a surge to decide that they can raise prices for passengers or pay drivers whatever they want. So they just are less reliant on surges. They're less frequent, and they're less. There's lower values. Okay, but here's the really interesting thing, and I think the thing that's maybe kind of annoying to a lot of drivers. Not only is our surges now less frequent and less valuable, but Uber is shaving the value of the actual pay that drivers get on surge trips. That is, they're not paying the full value. Why do I say that? Well, we looked at the total price that a driver was paid in 2024 with and without a surge. And what we discovered is rather than just adding the same surge value to both what the rider paid and the driver was paid, Uber was really jacking up the price. So when you say to a driver, hey, there's a $3 surge, the rider was being charged on average 68% more than that $3, whatever that would be, $4, $6, or $7. And the driver was being paid less than the full value of the surge because Uber was shaving the base price to which the surge was added. Yep. So the combination of this is that Uber's take rate on surges went from 29% in 2020, early 2022, very low amount, lower than non-surge trips, to 44%, 15 percentage point increase. You only can get that if you are jacking up the price on top of surges for what riders pay and shaving the value of the price that drivers are paid for the surge. And you put those two together, and in the last box, it shows how much Uber's gross profit per surge trip was and now is. 2022 on trips that had a surge Uber on average made $4.25 on all of those surge trips in 2022. And in 2024, on surge trips, they were making $8.66. If ever there was a case that you're jacking up prices here and shaving pay there, surge is your animal. So there you go.
Yep. Yep. So, well, Len, thank you for breaking it all down. But there's a lot more in the article.
Yep.
Let's quickly touch upon the Oxford College's not findings, but there was an article which I tweeted out, which was by The Guardian. FYI, folks, this is not something that I usually do, but this is Len's findings are going to get picked up by mainstream media shortly. So I will tweet those out and we'll post those on our channel as well by major news outlets. So, we thank our friends in the journalist community to pay attention to this, obviously. And so let's quickly talk about what the Oxford College in UK found out of 247 drivers and millions of data points that they looked at, although they did not go as deep as you did, or they did not try to reverse engineer the algorithm, the pricing algorithm, because the drivers in the UK went to court to get the right for Uber to provide their own data. Basically, the way I'm looking at this, Len, is that they have our data, they have deep machine learning, they have AI, they have all these tools. They are using our own data against us, actually. That's what is happening here. And so they did do the analysis, and the analysis concluded pretty much the same thing that you came up with.
Yeah, I want to stress this was, thank you for tweeting that, because I wasn't aware. Actually, I had a driver text me, and then I saw your tweet. And the honest truth is I had no idea that Oxford University was conducting their study and has been working hard at this over the same period of time, long time that I have. Nor were they familiar with what I did. The source of data was the same, that in both cases, they and I used trip history data on drivers. I only had a handful of drivers. As Sergio, you just said, I think they had 250 some odd.
Yeah.
So they had extensive thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of trips over, many more drivers than I had. At a broad level, they came out with exactly the same findings that I did. If you remember that very first chart, which showed that from the instant that upfront pricing was introduced in the UK, here, both rider pay went up, driver pay went down, take rate went up. And it's just clearly attributable to the instant in time that upfront pricing came in. So there you go. I went a little more into depth, like the two analysis we just talked about on forward dispatch trips and surge pricing. But at a very broad level, they got exactly the same findings as we did. So there you go.
Okay. Yeah. I don't think it was a coincidence. I think the findings were extremely similar, actually, to what you came up with.
Yep.
So this is the time. I don't want to get your blood pressure up, Len. Okay. So don't. I got to read you.
I just have juice. I don't have a beer, but
okay. I gotta read you Uber's official statement that was sent to me. So here it goes, and I will give you a chance to respond to this, and then we'll conclude with is this a one and done deal, and what could drivers learn about all of this, right? Because I think there is a fine line here to understand. Anyway, so here's Uber's official statement. Mr. Sherman's claims are wildly misleading based on just one driver's story and a lot of leaps. No one knows better than the Rideshare guy audience. Now, I don't know why they put that in there. The Rideshare guy audience, that there are more than 8 million drivers and delivery people using Uber, many who make their data public. And yet, Sherman chose to base his findings on the story of just one. The idea that upfront pricing is some secret playbook for deception is fiction, not fact. Uber's pricing is about giving both sides of the marketplace transparency, not hiding the ball. Okay, so that was their statement. And I told them, I promised them, I read them. And so you can respond for a minute or so.
So I guess they didn't like the report.
I guess.
I'll tell you, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what I think. It really doesn't. It matters a lot more what your listeners think. It matters what state legislatures think. It matters what the Federal Trade Commission thinks, all of whom now have my report, all of whom have, and I've forwarded to them since I learned about it literally yesterday, the Oxford University reports. And, folks can decide for themselves. What was the term they used? Wildly misleading storytelling. Folks can decide for themselves whether what I've tried to share today is wildly misleading and storytelling, and in conjunction with similar research projects that used more feedback, more driver input than I had, or not. Look, there's very good reasons for Uber to not want to be forthright and clear in sharing with us, the audience, and all the constituencies I just mentioned, what the real deal is with their business operations. Look, workers want to feel valued and that they're getting a square deal. Riders, customers don't like to feel like they're being taken advantage of. And Uber's doing exactly that millions of times a day. They're not valuing their drivers, and they're taking advantage of customers in the pricing policies they put in place. And I don't blame them for not wanting to make that terribly clear and explicit. But when they come out with these kinds of criticisms of my study, of the Oxford University study, and in the past, I've had the same thing happen every time I've tried to dig into their business practices. They come out with these, attack dog, wildly misleading. What did they say the last time? Our take rate is nowhere near 40%. You are profoundly wrong, or something to that effect. But notice that they never back up these critiques with hard data. I mean, I can only dream of having access to the kind of data and extent of data that Uber has. So if you think I've overstated take rates, if you think I've overstated, show us the money. Put your money where your mouth is. Tell us exactly what your trend line has been in U.S. rideshare take rates from 2019 to 2025. I want to see it. I've done the best damn job I can showing you what I think it is based on as much data as I can get my hands on. If you think that is profoundly, wildly, misleadingly wrong, put your money where your mouth is. Put the data out there. Put it out there. If you are not shaving surge bonuses, do the same analysis I did on millions of drivers, not just the handful I had. Look, you guys could have irrefutable proof that everything I've said is wildly, misleadingly wrong. Put it out there. I would love to hear it. I would love to learn the drivers are getting a better deal than I think they are.
Yeah. Well, I think
they won't do it. And it's a good reason they won't.
Well, obviously, and I read their response to the Oxford report as well. It's pretty similar, although not as scathing as yours. But I think yours went deeper. That's why I think they just chose to do it.
Well, they said, I read it and said they didn't recognize. We don't even recognize what data. We don't even recognize what data you're using. It's Uber's data. It's Uber's
So for
data.
a few hundred of you who are here, and for thousands that are going to watch this later, we will put some screenshots of. Actually, Len has a pretty simple, letter of how to access your own data. In certain states, it's your legal right to access your data. For example, California. In some states, it may not be. I don't know, but we'll dig into that. And so is this a one and done, Len? Are you done with this? Or do you want more data? Because now you're going to have 1,000 people willing to share their data with you.
Let me get back to that. I got some trauma coming up. You got my blood pressure up.
I have a life. Len goes, I have a life. Okay. All right. Okay. Ron is just not pushing you. We can't lose you. So, well, I don't know. I'll give you the floor, man. I'll give you the floor for the next 1 minute. You know, I thank you for what you do for the driver community. You've been a great friend to the show and to the channel, to me personally, and Chris, obviously, and to all the drivers, around the globe, not just the US. And I think what you say has weight. And yeah, I'm just going to give you the floor and you close the segment up.
Okay, well, I didn't prepare a closing
You
statement.
don't have to. From the heart, Len, from the heart.
No, let me just close with a couple of thoughts that I've been thinking a lot about, not just about Uber, but a lot of companies in general. And it's what I believe is the importance for any company, particularly a company in a service business. And that's what Uber is. It's delivering a service, a very valuable service. 100 million people, frequent users around the world. It's a great service. But I think a service-based company in particular needs to develop the trust of its customers and employees or workers, call it what you will. And to be very frank and blunt, I believe Uber CEO has gotten some very bad advice in the sense that the company's reaction, which you just shared with us to my work, but to anyone's work, is this attack dog, we're right, they're completely wrong. And nothing that I've heard today, and again, it doesn't matter what I think, it's what your audience thinks, would instill credibility and trust if I were on the receiving end of that. And you could ask your drivers, and they kind of sit there with their text box going now, do you trust this company to treat you fair and square, be straightforward and honest with you, and be candid with you, and not take advantage of you? And I believe they have lost the trust of the driver community and a lot of folks in the rider community as well. And that, in the long run, is not a good way to run a business, in my humble opinion.
Okay. Well, here's Professor, please don't say Len, Professor Len Sherman from Columbia Business School. My hat's off to you, sir.
Thank you.
Keep him coming. Keep the pressure on. And you're always welcome here, obviously. So great job. Thank you for doing this. And our audience appreciate it. And I appreciate it personally. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thanks for watching. That short little clip was from our live stream, Show Me the Money Club, with Sergio and myself, Tuesdays, 6 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Pacific. Make sure you subscribe, turn on all notifications so you'll be notified when we go live, as well as all of our awesome content. Make sure to check out this video right here, which will take you to the entire live stream, or check out this video right there. All right, drive smart, everyone.